Hi, my name is Jai Bansal, and I'll be talking about my paper titled A Deontological Approach to Racial Justice. So, starting with some context about the paper that I wrote. The class I wrote this paper was History 1420 Post-War America from the Cold War to the Present, with Professor Jefferson Cowley. And the class basically examines primarily the social and political history of the United States over the last 50 years, focusing on things such as the rise of liberalism and neoconservatism, globalism, and the transformations in politics of class, race, social identity, gender, and immigration. It's a really great class that I would highly recommend anyone takes if they have the opportunity to. So, on this paper specifically, this paper was the third and final report we had to do for the class. The prompt for the paper was essentially that we had to resolve a debate that we were having in class. We had to intervene in the Gitlin-Dyson debate on the best method for progressives to take in pursuing their political agenda in the future. Basically, the debate was situated in the 1960s. And in the 1960s, there was a pretty good time for progressives in the United States, who made huge strides on class, race, and gender issues. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Food Stamp Act in 1963, and the Equal Pay Act in 1963 ushered in a new wave of Rooseveltian-era politics that were aimed at equality and remedying injustices. By the end of the 1960s, after the death of Martin Luther King Jr., there were splinters forming in progressive factions on how to continue fighting for their rights. Specifically on the issue of race, there were two main trains of thought that were prevalent. So the first one was Todd Gitlin, who basically argued that the future of politics required a return to class and economics as the primary issues, while retreating from the divisive issues of gender and race. Meanwhile, Michael Dyson argued that Gitlin was whitewashing complicated issues, and identity-based politics based on race and gender were the only ways to progress in a more equitable manner. So in the essay, we were asked to defend which of these approaches was the best way to have long-term social justice. We were given essays by each author, and we were asked to use these, as well as other course materials, as evidence to justify our arguments. So, I ended up picking the Dyson approach of identity politics, the second one that I explained, as the way to go, which scholars consider the more radical approach. It's more of a burn it all down kind of thing. I actually spent a lot of time thinking about what the right pick was because both authors obviously make great points with great evidence and great arguments. So I think this kind of goes with a lot of persuasive essays in general, especially those about history and political science. History, political science, sociology, all of these subjects are pretty ambiguous, subjective, controversial, and usually, actually all the time, there's not really a right answer. Too often, one of the frequent mistakes that students and even scholars make when writing on the subjects in their arguments is that the arguments are too unilateral because they just want to be right, and they purposely choose to ignore facts and arguments that detract from their original argument. I know in high school and even earlier in this class I used to do that, and I tried to veer away from that a little in this essay. So in my paper, my thesis is essentially that establishing a real framework of justice in the minds of Americans is more important than passing redistributive economic policies, which is why I side with Dyson's identity politics approach. So, like I was saying earlier, I actually concede to the opposite side the fact that Gitlin's approach of class-based politics will lead to more progressive policies being passed. I think it makes sense that if progressive leaders don't alienate significant factions by bringing up controversial things like race, they can build stronger coalitions and pass more policies. However, the analysis I make is that these policies really are not as important as establishing real frameworks of justice in the eyes of Americans. So talking about race, even if it is polarizing, confronts the nation that whiteness in its current form is no more than a mechanism to control blackness, which is basically what Gitlin argues. Even if progressive policies are passed, whites will control how the policies are implemented and will use them as a tool to maintain their grasp of power, because they don't really have an intrinsic desire to aid Black America and relinquish their own power. This is why I think talking about race and not ignoring it is more important than simply the quantity of policies being passed. In fact, I argue in my paper that the reason that so many of the liberal policies from the 1930s to the 1970s collapsed in a conservative revolution was because these policies were passed on false premises and intentions and didn't deal with the root causes of injustice. A little bit more about my process in writing this paper. My biggest motivation was easily my time participating in high school debate. So I was really involved in my school's debate team, and in my sophomore year, one of the topics we had was to debate whether the United States federal government should pay reparations to African Americans We had to debate this for 2 months, and originally my pro argument for the topic was that reparations would help to alleviate the poverty through education, monetary, and housing recompensation. However, as the topic progressed, I changed my case to a much simpler version, that because the United States federal government had wronged African Americans in the past, it was simply the right thing to pay them for those wrongs. My argument in this essay mirrors the conclusion I reached while debating 3 years ago, that we should focus on race because racial justice is a really big problem and we can't forever ignore it, and it's just the right thing to do. However, I think the issue is more complex than I was able to discuss in 1,000 words, and I'm really excited to keep learning about it and discussing it in my time at Vanderbilt. Thank you.